Thank you so much, Dr. Massoumi, for speaking to me today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, Mejgan, for reaching out.
I want to start sort of in regards to your work. What got you to study Afghan music and radio?
So before I got into the study of the history of Afghanistan and the history of music and radio particularly, that's my specialty. I work on the history of radio. I actually had degrees in architecture and urban planning. I did something fundamentally different from what I'm doing right now with my life. Afghanistan was always something that I was curious about knowing more. I left the country when I was a very small child. I was an infant when we left at the height of the Cold War in the early 80s, basically 1980, my family left. I grew up in a household that very much was invested in preserving Afghan culture through the arts, through poetry, through literature, through music, through engagement with our culture in different ways. So this was also always something that was celebrated. So yeah, growing up, I always was curious about this part of the world. I studied architecture and planning honestly with the purpose of I want to be a builder and I want to build and I want to learn how to build to be able to go back home and help with physical reconstruction efforts. And that took me on all different kinds of journeys and pathways that I could never foresee myself. I ended up being really interested in international development and poverty alleviation. So I studied architecture, then I got a master's immediately after in urban planning with this focus on the developing world and trying to understand how my adopted country, the United States, engages with Afghanistan to help the country rebuild itself. And so I learned about things like the United States Agency for International Development, USAID. I critiqued these development programs. I worked in this field after getting a master's for several years. And then I was at a point in my career where I had reached the glass ceiling, and without a PhD, I couldn't move higher into positions that were desirable to me. I applied for programs in history because I knew I had interests in history. I didn't know exactly what. I knew I was interested in the region of Afghanistan and the regions that it encompasses, meaning Central Asia, South Asia, and the Middle East. I really didn't know what exactly I wanted to specifically focus on. And one of my assignments for graduate school was to write a paper. My advisor basically read the paper and offered feedback and said, you know, Mejgan, this is interesting, but I feel like it's lacking passion. Your writing is lacking passion. And I said, well, I know I'm interested. So as a historian in our training, we have to kind of pick a time period that we're interested in exploring. And I said, I'm really interested in the 60s and 70s. This was the heyday of my parents' time. I don't really know what happened during this time period, but people often talk about how great it was and how there's so much peace then and just how the country was opening up at that time, but I really don't know anything about it. And one of the things a lot of people kind of talk to me about is music, and Ahmad Zahir's name gets dropped a lot. And so my advisor said, why aren't you writing about Ahmad Zahir? And I said, I didn't know I could. And he's like, of course you can. So as I started to research about Ahmad Zahir, I realized how much radio had played a role in furthering his own career. And so my project changed, sort of it evolved and ebbed and flowed in these different ways, starting first with Ahmad Zahir's life, and then it changed to, wait a minute, radio is really taking root and shape here in a way that opens up Afghanistan's history to its surrounding regions and to the world. Like, this is really cool stuff. And so here I am, and now working on a book on the history of radio in Afghanistan and exploring how radio lends itself to a telling of this part of the world that is unfamiliar for most, because it's a cultural history, it's a people's history, and it's a history of resistance, it's a history of love, it's a history of connection to people and to the world. And I think that is starkly different from the narratives that typically historians give of this part of the world, which is usually laced in war, which is usually laced in some security issue, or in these tropes that Afghanistan has often been unfortunately mired in, and in a very pejorative way, whether it's through its tribes or through Islam or through patriarchy, and also just these negative stereotypical images of Muslims, so on and so forth. And so opening up history on the pages of radio really lent itself to more nuance. And I really like that. And it connected me, but also I think helps connect others to a different side of this incredible country.
Well, it is an incredible country.
Yeah.
It is complicated, especially the time period you've chosen, the 60s and 70s. Radio was just emerging. And so I'm really interested in how you conducted your research, given so much of history is lost or scattered or destroyed.
Mm-hmm.
What resources do you rely on to uncover music history during that time, but also how did war impact that time?
Absolutely. This is an excellent question, Marjan. I had to travel far and wide. I started actually here in the United States with our large diaspora communities, and I started collecting oral histories from radio producers to radio announcers to musicians. I started speaking to people, scholars that had worked on the history of music from Afghanistan. I went in search of archives in India, in Tajikistan, in Afghanistan, in France, in England, in Germany, in Canada. So it was a research trip that took me to a lot of different places. And as a historian, our stock and trade is the archive. Searching for archives and also searching for the history of something that is scattered because of over 5 decades of war is a challenging exercise. And I think what really helped me piece together what is otherwise a broken history is speaking to people and collecting oral histories from anyone willing to speak to me. This was a definitely challenging mission for several different reasons. One, because despite the fact that I was a researcher and a young scholar, that didn't necessarily always translate to a person on the other side trusting me and my motive and who I am. Typically in the community, when someone doesn't know you or your family, they are more reserved to speak to you and to share with you because they don't know your motive. And rightfully so, because after so many decades of war and certain abuses that have happened to people and our communities, it's right for them to be cautious and say, well, I don't know you. Even if you're a researcher and you have the credentials, I don't know you. And I don't know if I'm comfortable to speak with you. It took a lot of time to develop these relationships of trust and to get people to simply tell me their stories of what they remember, what they were doing in relation to the radio, and to open up and share.
Your specific time frame that you studied was the 60s and 70s. I want to
Yes.
know, what were people listening to at the time and why was radio such a powerful medium?
This is another excellent question, Marjan. I cannot say that I know what the entirety of the country was listening to in the 60s and 70s. Different parts of the country were listening to different kinds of things. Radio was still considered an expensive and hot commodity at this time until transistor radios got on the market where you could buy a radio and operate them with cheap batteries. But until then, people were saving up to buy a radio. Listening to radio was very much a communal event. So like one person in a village or in a community or in a neighborhood would have a radio, and neighbors and families and so on would gather together to listen to radio. Before I can tell you, I can say more about what people were listening to in the 60s and 70s. It's important to also know what listening looked like. And it was very much a communal and community event. When radio itself as the technology became nationalized, meaning that before 1964, radio, because of the radio transmitters, radio was only aired in Kabul. In 1964, the country acquired German transmitters that allowed sound to travel larger distances, even outside of Afghanistan. So one could be sitting in South Africa somewhere and listen to Radio Afghanistan or elsewhere in the world. So in 1964, one of the things that the country started to do and invest in is building loudspeakers in main central squares of cities around the country to distill radio, to amplify it. And, the being a government-owned institution and technology also meant different kinds of programming. So in terms of things people were listening to, music, of course, was a big component, but education was also a big component. And the government was invested in educating the populace, sort of building an educated workforce and a population ready to meet the demands of a 20th century world. And so in terms of music people were listening, again, I can answer this question specifically to Kabul. The sound was incredibly cosmopolitan. The three major music centers or distributors were, of course, Radio of Afghanistan, Afghan music, and I believe it was Kabul music. Radio Afghanistan Music Center and Kabul Music were recording musicians' music. These were recording studios, but they were also selling the music, right? Selling the records, selling the cassettes, so on and so forth. Kabul itself was a cosmopolitan hub, getting imported music from all over the world. So one could be listening to Radio Afghanistan musicians alongside the Beatles. And so there's even hours on the radio dedicated for international music to stream in, but there's also hours dedicated for Kharabati musicians to be listened to, or the classical music tradition, or for pop music to be listened to. If one is tuned into the radio in Kabul, they're hearing an array and a mix of global sounds from around the world, and they are becoming very curious about these sounds. And of course, our own musicians within the country are experimenting with global sounds from around the world, one of which, of course, is famously Ahmad Zair, and he's known for mixing sort of East and Western musical traditions in his music.
Speaking of Ahmad
Yeah.
Zair, now we're in a time where there's a ban on music, and it has happened before, but it doesn't mean that just because there wasn't a music ban prior to when the Talib has taken over, that there wasn't censorship and that there wasn't control. So Ahmad Zair was one of a very famous artist who had to deal with censorship and control over his artistic work. Can you describe what loopholes he used and how he got his work to airwaves?
There's several different factors that enabled Ahmad Zair to do what he was able to do through music. I don't think we can ignore this is the son of a prime minister of Afghanistan. He is an elite, and he has access and influence in ways that others may not. And so he uses this to his advantage. He is very aware of the music and also the literature, the poetry that's coming in from neighboring Iran. And, bookshops in Afghanistan are selling magazines, they're selling books, and Ahmad Zair is really interested. He's a cosmopolitan person himself, being the son of a prime minister, again, affords him this access to global sounds and literature from other parts of the world. And so he's picking up compositions. But one of the things that he does when authoritarianism in Afghanistan starts to dial up more and more during the time of Daoud Khan and later with Taraki, Ahmad Zair starts to use poetry that has double meanings. Poetry is passed down through oral transmission, of course, because we're talking about a society that unfortunately has a large illiteracy rate. And so people access and also understand multiple meanings through poetry. And so someone like Ahmad Zahir uses this to his advantage. As the government is restraining and constricting what can actually be broadcast on air, Ahmad Zahir uses the poetry of communist Nobel laureate Abul Qasim al-Lahuti to sing one of his most revolutionary songs, Zindagi Akhir Sarayat.
Zindagi Akhir Sarayat, Bandagi dar kar mein, Bandagi gar shart bashad, Zindagi dar kar mein.
He's able to sort of help people translate the sentiments of his time through the music that he is singing. And he goes under the radar, or he passes through the censors, because he's using the poetry of poets that the regimes at the time would have approved of. Or he is cleverly sort of using themes of love and oppression to help relay those sentiments of his time. So there's always a double meaning, sort of, or a triple meaning in the lyrics that he chooses. I will also say that some of his songs absolutely are censored too. He doesn't always pass all the censors, and he gets in trouble. But this doesn't stop them from sort of being circulated underground and reaching people in other ways, particularly with the advent of cassette, right? And people being able to record things in a clandestine way.
Now, I want to talk a little bit about women at the time. Both performers and broadcasters, how were they received, and what was it like for them to work in a space that was shifting and changing?
In a conservative society that is Afghanistan, women entering the music scene was not sort of favorably viewed upon, and there was definitely negative connotations associated with it, negative perceptions of a woman in the music scene, as they were for a man. Becoming a respected musician was something that was incredibly difficult in Afghanistan's society because of certain stereotypical understandings people have about the place of music in a predominantly Muslim society. There's confusion about the place of music within Islam amongst the people of Afghanistan. And so for women in particular, penetrating into the industry and gaining respect was a huge undertaking because of everything that they had to endure, from being sort of compared to being a prostitute to being considered a loose woman. They had to endure these things in order to be able to do what they essentially love to do, which is to sing or to perform. This is a huge challenge. There are some strides that women absolutely make to open up the space, that as more sort of elite classes of people were entering the industry, this helped the status of music and musicians in the country. And so people were slowly becoming more open to having their sons and daughters enter this industry and take it on as a serious profession. But that was still sort of a huge minority of people who are okay with their children pursuing music seriously. Now, women who are working for the radio stations as announcers and producers, they also experience all kinds of challenges in the workplace. However, there is a state effort to get more women in the workplace. So young women within the fields of journalism and communications from the universities are being recruited to come and work as radio announcers and radio producers on radio. There's also something to be said about the fact that radio, it's an invisible medium in the sense that These women aren't on TV and you can't see their faces, but you can hear their voices. And so this kind of gave access and ability for some women to be able to go and work for radio. And in other ways, it proved an interesting, provocative challenge for society to deal with, like the evocativeness of a woman's voice on radio versus a man's voice on radio. From the women that I have interviewed and researched, I think some of their biggest challenges were probably in the workplace where with their male counterparts, where there were power struggles involved, efforts to be taken seriously as producers, where they kind of had to fight for space, but also fight for what gets aired on radio, how interests and programs get shaped on the radio. Nonetheless, some of the programming that women came up with became some of the most popular shows on radio, particularly around poetry reading, programs and shows around storytelling and also idioms. So in Farsi, we are a language of idioms. There's lots of proverbs and sayings and idioms that come within our speaking. So when in speaking in Farsi, people are not always direct, but perhaps a proverb or an idiom can be a way to kind of not be direct, but still get to the point you want to make. And so shows around these things become very, very popular too. And women are behind the creation of these things. The other kinds of radio programs that women were behind that were very popular were the kinds where people call in and give their requests. They're not calling in at this time because telephone shows aren't that advanced yet in the 60s and 70s, but they are writing in letters. And so people would listen to the radio and wait for, like, sit in hopes that the radio announcer would be playing something that they requested to be played via letter.
How did Afghanistan's soundscape change when war broke out? Sort of, how does war impact what people are listening to? Do people go to the radio for comfort, for escapism?
Sure. I will say that during times of war, I mean, radio, the national radio station is either cut off. During the time of the Taliban, of course, Radio Sharia is implemented, and they have their own propaganda campaign over what people can listen to, whether that's Quranic recitations or edicts and creeds coming from their establishment. Even during times of so-called relative peace, people are also listening to other radio stations being aired into Afghanistan that are not financed by the state. So people are listening to BBC, they're listening to Voice of America, they're listening to stations coming out of Pakistan, Iran, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Russia, the former Soviet Union, so on and so forth, being aired into the country to get different kinds of news that isn't being patrolled or controlled by what the state, by state propaganda, basically. So during times of war, people, they're either accessing alternate radio stations, or they're in a situation where if they are tuning in to what the state is giving them to listen to, it's propaganda, but they clearly understand that what they're listening to is propaganda. But I will also say this, that during war, I think listening to radio for leisurely purposes is not the first thing on people's minds. People are listening to the radio, honestly, for news, to figure out, what do I need to do to protect my family? What's happening in my environment around me? That's what I'm listening to the news for. Or I'm listening to the news to figure out how much the cost of meat is today in the market, because I need to feed my family, and can I afford that today? In times of war, people are worried about their survival.
I want to know, why do you think regimes see music as such a threat? What is the power that music is, or radio is, that is one of the ways a regime takes control?
There's something very powerful and threatening about how people define themselves through a culture. And music, of course, plays a huge role in defining a people's culture because of what it captures through sound, through the tangible and intangible, right? Whether it's the musical instruments we're listening to, and it's just, we're listening literally to music, or we're listening to lyrics and it means something to someone. We often associate sounds with memories of a place or with people that we're with, or of a time that we're in. And that carries a lot of weight for people. Now, when a regime comes into place, a new regime, let's say it is an oppressive regime in the case of Afghanistan, and let's take, for example, the Taliban of today. They want to create their own culture and create their own history. In order to do that, they have to wipe out what was there, or attempt to do so, or make it illegal, or censor it. And so this is where music and any kind of art making becomes so radical and important as a form of resistance, because people are saying, no, I hold on to the memory of my culture through this. I hold on to the memory of my culture and my place by singing Byaake Burim Ba Mazar Mullah Muhammad Jan. That folkloric song carries this memory that children of today in the diaspora will listen to, right? And it carries weight for them. Can the Taliban wipe out such a song or a memory because they're trying to instill their own culture and their own value in such a place? Absolutely not. They can't. Fortunately, memories through song are things that are both tangible and intangible, because you can physically move around with a song on a cassette. Now, of course, digitally, right? The songs are on our computers and our iPhones, and they're archives, right? They're literally archives for us. A song you might have heard just yesterday that resonates with you is now part of your archive today, right? Because you're still thinking about it, and it carries weight for you. Sort of the same thing goes for Afghanistan and its history of sounds via music that means something to people, and that any kind of regime wishing to wipe out this culture cannot penetrate. They cannot, and they won't be able to. Music is too old. It's too embedded in who we are as a people to ever be erased out of memory completely. And music carries so much history for people. Again, just to go back to the crux of your question, regimes wishing to ban music out of a place are really interested in implementing their own understandings of culture. And so the threat is, as long as this other culture exists, I can't establish fully my power over this place. Or say, hey, this stuff in the past never existed. What I declare is what is in existence and what your culture is. And I think specifically for the people of Afghanistan, they laugh at that. Most of them laugh at that and say, no, we're not going to accept this idea that what was previously here is now erased and we're starting from a clean slate. And yes, welcome Taliban. I don't think for the majority of people in the country, that's the case, or they'll allow that to happen.
Many Afghans have left the country during different waves of migration, and the music they hold on to often reflects the era during the time that they've left. This creates what some have formed as a cultural fossilization, where the same songs and the same styles are replayed over and over again, whether it's covers or remixes or remakes of the same song. And newer songs really struggle to take root. From your perspective, how does cultural fossilization shape Afghan music? And do you think that the diaspora has the ability or the power to move Afghan music forward outside of Afghanistan?
Marjan, I don't necessarily view this as cultural fossilization. I consider it cultural preservation. I think we are speaking about a geography that has endured over 5 decades of war, and people have memories and passions and histories tied to songs that make them think of better times, or maybe it makes them think of sad times, but it's comforting in a way, right? It's cathartic in a way for them. And so they keep singing these songs that perhaps we all know in the community, but that gives them comfort. And there's a reason for that. And I think it's beautiful that becomes preserved, even fossilized, because people have old meanings attached to them, but also in playing them in the current moment, they're also attaching new meanings to those songs. Like, yeah, when I was leaving Afghanistan on August of 2021, this song meant something to me. And here I am now in Canada or the United States, and I'm listening to that same song. And now I listen to those lyrics differently. And that song means something else for me. And I'm so happy I went to that concert and the musician played that song. The song can stay the same or be fossilized, but the meaning changes depending on what's happening in one's life. In terms of new music penetrating the scene, I listen to a lot of new tunes, and I think that there's a lot of new artists giving us really great music to enjoy. Do I think that it's of the quality of the 60s and 70s? Is a different conversation. Perhaps I'm biased because I study this time period and feel that the investment that musicians had in their craft in that time period is different to the types of investments that musicians have today. I think there's something to be said about the need to make an earning, and in today's world, the need to make an earning and to commercialize music in a way that will get you enough listeners to be able to make a living. Can you do that, but can you also be interested in your craft in an intellectual way, right? I think our musicians from the past, if I may say, in my own humble opinion, had a really good grasp on how to strike that balance. And so I think our musicians of today are still grappling with that, and rightfully so, again, because there hasn't been a steady progression. We have lived through so many decades of war. We can't have this expectation, right, that our music should have evolved in this kind of formulaic way, right? It hasn't evolved in that way. That's all just to say, I think older music has its place and its currency in a very important way. And I think new music has an opportunity to shape the now and the future interesting ways. And as a listener, I'm here for it. I'm here to listen to it.
When you think about Afghanistan's musical legacy, considering all the waves and flows of war, displacement, and now a ban on music in Afghanistan, what gives you hope that these sounds and these stories will survive?
Music is something that is a vessel of memory. Its tangible and intangible qualities are not something that are going to make it go away overnight. Again, I think there's something about how much history and memory are encompassed in these sounds that have been given to us from generation to generation to generation that will be preserved over time. And also, going back to your previous point about how musicians are reproducing these songs in different ways, remixing them, so on and so forth, that's also giving new life to a song that is old. And maybe it will generate people, more people like you, to become curious about it and ask questions like, what are the origins of this? What are the origins of a song like Laili Laili, or anything else that comes to mind that is popular to you? Where does it come from? And that opens up a history for someone to explore. And so that gives me a lot of hope. I also think just the vast amount of interest from people in the diaspora and elsewhere interested in music will continue to produce and create sounds for us to listen to. I don't think it's going anywhere. I think we are a culture that loves music. I think we are a culture that loves art making. And I think every generation lends itself to people that are really good at their craft that then become popular, and we all have the privilege and pleasure of listening to. And I don't see that dying anytime soon, because our culture and our music making, it is so rich. I don't think it's going anywhere.
Well, I hope that we listen to Afghan music in Afghanistan and
Yes.
in exile as well. I want to thank you for speaking with me, and
Thank you.
thank you for your time.
I thank you so much for your interest and your time.
Thank you so much.